What if everything you think you know about the world is just a shadow of something bigger? If what we call reality is perhaps only our perspective? For thousands of years, people have been asking themselves exactly such questions. They doubted gods, traditions, certainties, and even their own sanity. Out of this doubt, out of this amazement at the world, something arose that was to change our history forever: philosophy. Before we dive into this journey through more than 2,500 years of intellectual history, I would like to ask you a question. What one question about life won't let you go? Is it the question of meaning? For freedom? Like happiness? Or what we can really know? Write your answer in the comments below. I want to know what thoughts are on your mind, because that's exactly where philosophy begins. If you are fascinated by big ideas, if you want to understand how our thinking today came about and why some questions remain timeless, then support this journey with a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any episode of this discovery tour through the history of thought. Because it all begins with a simple moment: the amazement that there is something at all, and not nothing. Chapter 1. The Origin of Thought, Myth and Logos. At the beginning there is no book, no theorem, no proof. In the beginning there is amazement. Man looks at the sky and sees the thunderstorm. He hears the thunder, feels the shaking of the earth, sees lightning splitting trees. He doesn't know why it's happening, but he knows it's happening. And this ignorance is not an empty hole. It is a space that wants to be filled. Before there was philosophy, there were stories. These stories were not just entertainment. They were in order. They explained the world, gave security, connected generations. Everything was embedded in them: nature, morality, death, love, war. The early cultures told of gods who stretched the sky, tamed the seas, brought fire or determined the seasons. Lightning was not a physical phenomenon, it was a sign of divine power. The harvest was not a biological cycle, it was mercy or punishment. In the Greek world, for example, poets such as Homer and Hesiod told of a divine order. In the Theogony, Hesiod describes the origin of the world as a succession of generations of divine beings. Out of chaos arises Gaia, the earth, then Uranos, the sky, then Titans, then the Olympian gods. The world here is not a mechanical process, but a family drama of cosmic proportions. We call this form of explaining the world myth. The myth is pictorial. He tells his story. He personifies. Natural forces become acting beings. The wind has intention. The sea has anger. The sun drives across the sky in the car. In myth, everything is meaningful, everything is interwoven with a greater plan. But at some point, something remarkable happens. Some people are starting to wonder if these stories really explain, or if they are just telling. They don't just ask the question, who did that? But what is it? They are no longer looking for a divine figure behind the phenomenon, but for a principle within the phenomenon itself. This is where the logos begins. The word logos originally means word, speech, reason, relation, law. While the myth speaks in images, the logos looks for reasons. While the myth depicts the world as a drama, the logos asks for structure. It's not a sudden break, but a slow transition, but it changes everything. In the 6th century BC, on the coast of Asia Minor, in cities like Miletus, a new kind of questioning emerged. Traders travel, cultures meet, knowledge is exchanged. And it is in this environment that a figure appears who is often referred to as the first philosopher, Thales of Miletus. Thales asks a radical question: what is the primordial substance that everything consists of? Not, which god created the world? But, what is it made of? His answer may seem simple to us today: water. But the decisive factor is not the answer. The type of question is decisive. Thales is looking for a unified principle, an archie, that underlies everything. For him, water is not just an element, but a basic principle. It can be solid, liquid, gaseous. It's everywhere. Perhaps, he thinks, everything is ultimately a form of it. With this question, the focus shifts. The world is no longer understood exclusively as a divine event, but as something that can be explained in itself. After Thales, other thinkers follow. Anaximander speaks of the pairon, the unlimited, as the origin of all things, something formless that underlies everything. Anaximenes sees air as a primordial principle. Each of them is looking for a rational, general explanation. This is new. Not because there are no more gods, but because they are no longer needed for this explanation. A particularly fascinating thinker of this period is Heraclitus. He looks at the world and recognizes not stability, but change. Everything flows, is the famous formula attributed to him. You can't step into the same river twice, because the water continues to flow and because we are also changing. For Heraclitus, the logos is the law of this change. Behind all the change is an order, a structure that he calls logos. The world is not chaos, but a tension of opposites, day and night, war and peace, life and death. It is precisely in conflict that harmony arises. Here something crucial becomes apparent. The logos is not only rational, it is universal. It applies to everyone. It is independent of tradition or authority. He is recognizable to anyone who thinks. But not everyone agrees. Parmenides radically disagrees. For him, change is an illusion. Being is, and non-being is not. What is real cannot change, because change would mean that something that is not becomes something that is. For Parmenides, true thinking is logically compelling. The senses are deceiving. Only reason leads to truth. With Heraclitus and Parmenides, two enormous positions are opposed. Everything is change, or nothing really changes. This tension will accompany philosophy for thousands of years. What is happening here is more than a new theory about natural products. It is a new attitude to reality. The world becomes the object of argumentative debate. Statements must be substantiated. Claims can be criticized. Truth is no longer exclusively handed down, it is sought. However, the transition from myth to logos does not mean that myth simply disappears. Rather, his role is changing. It is questioned, reinterpreted, symbolically read. Even later philosophers fall back on myths, but they do so consciously, reflectively. Why is this change happening in Greece of all places? There is no clear answer. But several factors probably play a role. The political structure of the polis with public discussion and debate, trade, contact with other cultures, the development of writing, the lack of a rigid priestly caste that claims sovereignty of interpretation. In this open atmosphere, thinking can become a public event. The decisive factor is that the logo claims universal validity. An argument is not convincing because it is old, but because it is logical. Authority shifts from tradition to reasoning. This also creates a new form of freedom. If the world can be explained rationally, then it is not arbitrary. If it is lawful, then it can be understood. And if you can understand it, you are not completely at its mercy. Man begins to understand himself no longer only as part of a divine order, but as a thinking being who can explore this order. Thinking becomes a force in its own right. And yet the amazement remains. Because even the logos does not begin with certainty, but with a question. Why is there something and not nothing? What is the origin? What remains in the change? What is real? These questions do not simply replace the myth, they transform it. The old stories lose their exclusive sovereignty of interpretation, but the longing for meaning remains. The logos is more sober, more critical, more analytical, but it springs from the same human experience, amazement at the world. You could say that the myth tells what the world means. The logos asks how it works. Both arise from the same need, orientation. The decisive difference lies in the method. The myth invokes tradition. Logos demands arguments. The myth is narrative. The logos is discursive. The myth creates identity. The logos creates criticism. With this step, Philosophy begins in the true sense of the word, not as a collection of opinions, but as a practice of reasoning, as a willingness to question everything, even the most obvious. The transition from myth to logos is therefore not a mere historical moment. It is a spiritual movement that repeats itself over and over again. Every time we ask why, we enter this field. Every time we don't settle for a simple story, but look for reasons, we continue that origin. The ancient thinkers could not have guessed what consequences their questions would have. Science, logic, metaphysics, ethics emerge from their reflections. But this first step is about something more fundamental, the discovery that thinking itself can be a method. The world is not only the stage of divine forces. It is a mystery that can be deciphered. And perhaps this is precisely the very origin of philosophy, the conviction that reality is understandable, and that we are capable of understanding it. Logos marks the beginning of a new era, but he remains vulnerable, because where there is argument, there can be contradiction. Where justification is given, it can be refuted. Truth becomes an open process. But this is precisely where his strength lies. The history of philosophy thus begins not with a ready-made answer, but with a new way of asking. And this way of asking changes everything. The narrated cosmos becomes an examined cosmos. Divine arbitrariness becomes lawfulness. Tradition becomes argument. And the amazed person becomes a thinking person. In the next chapter, this thinking will take a new turn. It will no longer deal only with nature, but with man himself, with virtue, justice, and the question of how to live. But before we go there, one thought remains. The step from myth to logos is not a victory of cold over fantasy. It is the courage not only to tell the world, but to want to understand it. Chapter 2. The Pre-Socratics, the search for the primordial substance. After humans began to no longer tell the world exclusively in stories, but to want to justify it, a new form of curiosity emerged. The question was no longer, who directs the events? But, what does it consist of? What is the basis of everything? What is the one behind the many? These thinkers, whom we now call Pre-Socratics, lived before or independently of Socrates. She was primarily interested in nature, but for her, nature did not just mean plants, animals, or stars. It was about the whole, about being itself. The central question was, is there a primordial substance, a first principle, from which everything emerges? An archie that stands behind all diversity? Thales, the beginning with water. Thales of Miletus is traditionally considered the first philosopher. Whether he was really the first is historically difficult to say, but it symbolizes a decisive new beginning. His answer to the question of origin was as simple as it was revolutionary: everything is water. To us, that sounds almost naive. But in the context of his time, it was a radical idea. Thales was not looking for a divine genealogy, a mythical tale. He sought a material principle that underlies everything. Water is changeable. It can be liquid, solid, or gaseous. It is vital. It seems to be present everywhere. More important than his concrete thesis, however, is the method. Thales doesn't just claim, he tries to explain. He is looking for unity in diversity. Behind the countless phenomena of the world, he suspects a common foundation. With this step, the world is thought of for the first time as something that can be explained from within itself. Nature is no longer understood as a stage for divine whims, but as a system with an inner structure. Anaximander, the unlimited. But the next generation already recognizes a problem. If water is the primordial substance, where does the opposite of water come from, such as fire? How can a certain element be the origin of all opposites? Anaximander, also from Miletus, therefore proposes a more abstract solution. The origin is not something specific like water or air, but the apeiron, the unlimited, the indeterminate. It is not a concrete substance, but an inexhaustible, formless source from which everything emerges. This is a huge step towards abstraction. The origin is no longer imagined sensually, but intellectually developed. The apeiron is eternal, unlimited, and encompasses everything. Opposites arise from it, warm and cold, dry and damp, and they return to it. Here another thought emerges that will shape philosophy, the idea of order and justice in the cosmos. Anaximander talks about things paying fines for their assaults. That still sounds mythical, but what is meant is a balance. The world follows a law. The search for unity. The early thinkers were united by one conviction: behind the visible diversity there must be a unity. The world is not a chaotic coexistence, but an orderly whole. Anaximenes saw this principle in the air. Compression and dilution create different things. Compressed air becomes water, then earth. Diluted air becomes fire. Change is therefore a gradual process. This is where a new understanding of nature emerges. Change is not arbitrary, but the consequence of processes. Everything can be explained, at least theoretically. But then a thinker emerges who radically exacerbates the problem. Heraclitus, everything flows. Heraclitus from Ephesus looks at the world and recognizes one thing above all: change. Nothing remains, everything changes. The famous thought that you can't step into the same river twice sums this up. The river is the same, and yet it is not, because new water is constantly flowing in. For Heraclitus, fire is the primordial principle, but here too, fire is meant less as a substance than as a symbol of constant becoming. The world is not a static entity, but a living process. But this change is not chaotic. He follows the logos, a reasonable law. Opposites are not contradictions, but tensions that hold the world together: day and night, life and death, war and peace. It is precisely in conflict that harmony arises, like a taut string. Heraclitus thus introduces a new dimension. Reality is not only unity, but also tension. His thinking is dynamic. Being is becoming. Parmenides, being is. And then something unexpected happens. Parmenides of Elia fundamentally contradicts this idea. For him, change is an illusion of the senses. True thinking leads to another insight: being is. Non-being is not. And nothing can arise from non-being. If something is real, then it cannot suddenly cease to be or emerge out of nothing. Change would mean that something that does not exist becomes real, but that is logically impossible. Parmenides distinguishes between the way of opinion and the way of truth. The senses show us a world full of movement and diversity. But reason says, true being is undivided, unchanging, eternal. Here early philosophy reaches a peak of abstraction. Being itself becomes the object of investigation. No longer a specific substance, but the question, what does it mean to be anyway? Parmenides forces philosophy to think logically consistently. He poses a challenge that continues to have an impact today. If everything is changing, how can it be permanent? And if being is unchanging, how do we explain change? The problem of being. With Heraclitus and Parmenides, two seemingly irreconcilable positions confront each other. One says, everything is movement. The other says, true being does not move. This tension becomes the engine of further philosophy. Because both positions have power. Our experience confirms Heraclitus. The world is constantly changing. But Parmenides' logic is just as compelling. Something cannot be and not be at the same time. The Pre-Socratics thus formulated the basic question that will accompany the entire Western philosophy. What is being? Is being something material? Is it a process? Is it immutable? Is it unity or multiplicity? These questions are not mere speculation. They affect our entire understanding of the world. If everything is change, then there is no absolute certainty. If being is unchanging, then our perceptions are deceptive. The courage to abstract. What distinguishes the Pre-Socratics is their courage to think radically. They break away from traditional narratives and face the world with reason. They do not accept that a phenomenon is explained just because it has been told. They are looking for principles. They are looking for necessity. They are looking for unity. In the process, concepts emerge that are still fundamental today: being, becoming, unity, multiplicity, law, logos, origin. Even if their concrete answers seem scientifically outdated today, their achievement remains enormous. They asked the question of the reason, and asked it rationally. For the first time, the world is thought of as something that is grounded in itself. It is not gods who govern the cosmos, but principles. The beginning of metaphysics. With the question of being, something new begins: metaphysics. The Pre-Socratics do not yet practice systematic ethics, no elaborate theory of knowledge. But they lay the foundation for everything that follows. Because whoever asks what is, must also ask how we recognize it. And anyone who asks about the origin must clarify what change means. The confrontation between Heraclitus and Parmenides will occupy later thinkers deeply. How can you think about change without contradicting it? How can one explain consistency without denying experience? These questions will eventually lead to new syntheses. But at this point in history, philosophy is still in its infancy. She feels her way forward. She experiments with thoughts. She dares to hypothesize. And in the process she discovers a tremendous power, the power of thought itself. Conclusion: the birth of ontology. The Pre-Socratics did more than search for a primordial substance. You have focused on the question of being. They have shown that the world can not only be experienced, but also understood. The amazement turned into an investigation. The narrative became argumentation. The observation became theory. With them begins ontology, the study of being. And with it begins a tradition that reaches into the present day. Because today we ask similar questions. What is the basic structure of reality? Does everything consist of matter, energy, information? Is the world static or processual? The terms have changed. The methods have become more precise. But the core remains the same. The Pre-Socratics had the courage to question the obvious. And in this movement lies the real origin of philosophical thought, the will to look behind the surface and to uncover the foundation. In the next chapter, the focus will shift. The question will no longer be just what the world is, but how man should live in it. Nature takes a step back. The focus is on people. Chapter 3. Socrates, the birth of ethics. With the Pre-Socratics, the focus was on nature, on being, on the basic structure of reality. But in the 5th century BC, the center of philosophical attention shifted. The focus is no longer on space, but on people. The question, what does everything consist of, no longer dominates, but how should I live? This shift marks the beginning of a new phase in philosophy, and its most formative name is Socrates. A city in upheaval. Socrates lived in democratic Athens, a city full of political debates, court cases, public speeches, and cultural flourishing. It was a time of upheaval. Traditional certainties crumbled. New teachers, the so-called sophists, offered lessons in rhetoric and argumentation for a fee. Those who could speak successfully could gain political power. In this atmosphere, truth became increasingly relative. It was less about what is true and more about what is convincing. Arguments became tools of success. Socrates opposed this trend. He wrote nothing. Everything we know about him comes from reports by others, especially his pupil Plato. But the picture that emerges from this is clear. Socrates did not understand philosophy as a doctrine, but as a way of life. He walked the streets of Athens, talked to politicians, poets, craftsmen, young men, and asked questions. Not knowing. The most famous sentence associated with Socrates is, "I know that I know nothing." Even if it was probably not formulated exactly like this historically, it gets to the heart of his stance. Socrates does not claim to be in possession of the truth. On the contrary, it begins with the admission of ignorance. But this ignorance is not resignation. It's a starting point. He observes that many people are convinced that they know something, for example, what justice is, what courage means, or what constitutes a good life. But if you ask them more closely, they falter. This is where his method comes in. The conversation as a method, moeutics. Socrates did not develop a systematic theory in the modern sense. His tool was conversation. In dialogues, he asks questions, examines answers, uncovers contradictions. This method was later called moeutics, the art of midwifery. Like a midwife, Socrates helps his interlocutor to bring his own thoughts into the world. He does not instruct, but leads to insight through questions. A typical dialogue goes like this. Someone claims to know what bravery is. Socrates asks for a definition. The interviewer gives examples. Socrates shows that examples are not a definition. A new definition is proposed. Socrates examines them, finds contradictions, and finally the interlocutor realizes that he does not know as clearly as he thought. This process can be unpleasant. Socrates makes people recognize their own insecurities. But this is exactly the core of his philosophy, self-knowledge. The turn to ethics. While the Pre-Socratics searched for the primordial substance, Socrates asks about the good life. What is virtue? What is justice? What is piety? These questions do not concern the structure of nature, but the structure of our actions. For Socrates, virtue, arete, is not merely a social convention. It is knowledge. Those who really know what is good will also act well. No one does evil intentionally, he is convinced. Misconduct arises from ignorance. This thesis is provocative. It contradicts the everyday experience that people act against better knowledge. But Socrates means something deeper. Whoever recognizes the good in its true meaning cannot help but choose it. Good is inseparable from knowledge. In this way, ethics becomes a question of knowledge. The soul at the center. Another central idea in Socrates is the care of the soul. While many Athenians strive for fame, fortune, or political influence, Socrates emphasizes that the most important thing is the inner constitution of man. The soul, understood as the seat of reason and character, must be nurtured. Not through material goods, but through reflection and virtue. A person who does wrong not only harms others, but above all himself, because it damages his soul. The real evil is not to suffer injustice, but to commit injustice. This is where ethics is radicalized. Morality is not just external adherence to rules. It is an inner attitude. The conflict with the city. Socrates' indefatigable questioning was not without consequences. Many felt exposed. His irony, his persistence, his questioning of authority made him uncomfortable. Finally, he was accused of godlessness and corruption of youth. He was accused of introducing new gods and tempting young people to doubt traditional values. In 399 BC, Socrates was sentenced to death. His reaction to this verdict is as important as his life. He could have fled. Friends offered help, but he decided to stay. He accepted the city's verdict, even if he considered it unfair. Why? Because he was convinced that injustice should not be repaid with injustice. His principles applied not only in conversation, but also in action. He drank the hemlock cup, and died surrounded by his friends. With this death, Socrates became a symbol of philosophical integrity. Philosophy was no longer just theory. It became an existential attitude. The importance of self-knowledge. Know thyself, this old saying from Delphi, is often associated with Socrates. For him, self-knowledge does not mean mere introspection, but critical examination of one's own convictions. Those who live without reflection do not really live. An unexamined life, he is credited with, is not worth living. This statement is radical. It places thinking above habit, reflection over tradition. It calls on people to take responsibility for their convictions. With Socrates, philosophy becomes a practice of self-examination. Virtue as a unity. Another central motif is the unity of virtues. For Socrates, courage, justice, prudence, and piety are connected. They are an expression of an orderly inner state. If virtue is knowledge, then moral errors are ultimately errors in thinking. Ethics and knowledge merge. This idea is later developed, criticized, and differentiated, but it sets a standard. Moral action is not merely adaptation to norms, but an expression of an understood good. The birth of moral philosophy. Socrates is the beginning of systematic ethics. He does not ask about cosmic elements, but about concepts of coexistence. He brings philosophy into everyday life. His influence can hardly be overestimated. Without him, there would be neither Plato's theory of ideas nor Aristotle's virtue ethics in its familiar form. But his real legacy is not a specific doctrine, but an attitude. Question. Check. Search for conceptual clarity. Live according to your insights. Thinking as a way of life. Socrates embodies a new role of the philosopher. He is not a natural scientist in the background, but a public thinker. Philosophy happens in dialogue, in exchange, in contradiction. Truth does not come from authority, but from argument, and it remains open to appeal. With him, philosophy becomes dialogical. Knowledge is not a solitary act, but a shared process. Conclusion: the focus is on people. With Socrates, the focus of philosophy shifts decisively. The question of being remains important, but it is supplemented by the question of the good life. Ethics takes center stage. Instead of asking about the primordial substance, one asks about virtue. Instead of cosmic principles, one asks for justice. Instead of asking about the laws of nature, one asks for self-knowledge. This turn is no less revolutionary than the transition from myth to logos. She makes it clear that the biggest challenge is not to understand the world, but to understand oneself. Socrates left no books, but his life and death established a tradition that continues to have an effect today. The idea that moral clarity arises from critical thinking is a cornerstone of Western philosophy. In the next chapter, one of his students will try to translate his teacher's thoughts into a comprehensive system. The questions remain, but they are lifted into a new dimension. The conversation turns into a theory. The search for virtue becomes a doctrine of ideas. Plato enters the stage. Chapter 4. Plato, the world of ideas. Socrates' death does not end his philosophy, it is only just beginning. One of his closest students, Plato, makes it his task to transform the Socratic question into a comprehensive philosophical system. While Socrates was mainly active in conversation and left no writings, Plato writes dialogues in which his teacher often plays the leading role. But in these texts, more than a memory unfolds. A new view of reality, knowledge, and politics emerges. Plato was faced with a problem that would occupy him for the rest of his life. How is certain knowledge possible? If opinions contradict each other, if perceptions can be deceiving, what is truth based on? And how can a just order arise when people are guided by ignorance and desires? His answer leads to one of the most influential theories in the history of philosophy, the doctrine of ideas. Underscore 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 underscore. The search for the immutable. Plato adopts from Socrates the conviction that concepts such as justice, courage, or beauty are not merely opinions. When we say that an action is just, we assume that we know what justice means. But in the world that can be experienced by the senses, everything seems to be relative and changeable. Here Plato picks up on the tension between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Parmenides, on the other hand, considered being to be unchangeable. Plato tries to convey these opposites. The sensual world, he argues, is indeed changing. Everything we see, hear, or touch changes. Things arise and pass away. But if everything is constantly changing, there can be no stable knowledge, only opinions. In order for there to be knowledge, there must be something that is unchangeable. Plato calls this immutable ideas or forms. By this he does not mean mere thoughts in the human head, but independent, objective realities. The idea of justice is not dependent on individual righteous actions. It is a perfect, timeless being in which concrete actions participate. Thus, alongside the visible world, there is an intelligible world, the world of ideas. It cannot be grasped with the senses, but only with thought. Underscore 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 underscore. The two worlds doctrine. Plato thus distinguishes between two levels of reality. 1. The world that can be perceived by the senses, transient, imperfect, changing. 2. The world of ideas, eternal, perfect, unchanging. A concrete table, for example, is never perfect. It can be damaged, it is made of a certain material, it has a certain shape. But we recognize it as a table because it participates in the idea of the table, in a perfect universal form that does not perish. The same applies to moral concepts. Individual righteous actions are always imperfect, but they refer to the idea of justice itself. In this way, Plato shifts the basis of knowledge. True knowledge does not refer to changeable things, but to ideas. The senses only provide opinions, doxa. Knowledge, episteme, comes from rational thinking. Underscore 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 underscore. The allegory of the cave. In order to illustrate this theory of knowledge, Plato sketches one of the most famous images in the history of philosophy, the allegory of the cave. Let's imagine people who have been tied up in a cave since birth. They are looking at a wall. A fire burns behind them, and other people move between the fire and the prisoners with objects. The prisoners only see the shadows of these objects on the wall. For them, these shadows are reality. One day, a prisoner is freed. At first, he is blinded by the firelight. Then he leaves the cave and steps into the sunlight. He realizes that what he previously thought was real were only shadows. Only outside does he see the things themselves, and finally the sun that illuminates everything. This image stands for the path of knowledge. The cave symbolizes the sensual world. The shadows stand for opinions and deceptions. The ascent from the cave is the arduous path of philosophical education. Finally, the sun represents the highest idea, goodness. For Plato, the good is the supreme principle. Just as the sun gives light in the visible world, so the idea of good makes knowledge and being possible in the intelligible world. Without them, nothing would be recognizable. The parable also contains a political dimension. When the Blessed One returns to the cave to free the others, he is met with rejection. The prisoners consider him confused or dangerous. Here the fate of Socrates is clearly hinted at. Underscore 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 underscore. Knowledge as memory. Another central idea of Plato is the theory of anamnesis, remembrance. If the soul has seen the world of ideas before its birth, then learning is actually a remembrance. Plato illustrates this in a dialogue by leading an uneducated boy to geometric insights through skillful questioning. The boy seems to be discovering knowledge that he has never learned. Whether one takes this theory literally or understands it symbolically, it underlines Plato's conviction that true knowledge does not come from sensory experience alone, but from thinking. Underscore 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 underscore. The state justice on a large scale. Plato's epistemology does not remain abstract. It has political consequences. If most people are trapped in the cave of opinions, who should govern a state? In his work The State, Plato sketches the picture of an ideal polis. For him, justice in the state corresponds to harmony between different parts, similar to the soul. Plato distinguishes between three parts of the soul. 1. The reasonable part, logos. 2. The courageous or energetic part. 3. The seeking part. Justice arises when each part fulfills its task and reason prevails. Applied to the state, this means that there are three classes: rulers, guardians, and producers. The rulers are supposed to be philosophers, because only they have insight into the world of ideas and recognize the good. The famous thought is, either philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers, otherwise there will be no just order. This thought is provocative. He puts knowledge above power. Domination is not a question of descent or wealth, but of insight. Underscore 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 underscore. Criticism and suspense. Plato's model is strict. He advocates comprehensive education, communal property for the guardian class, and even control of poetry and art if they convey misconceptions. There is a tension here. The search for objective truth leads to an ideal state that can restrict individual freedom. Plato's thinking is shaped by the trauma of Socrates' death. He distrusts a democracy dominated by opinions and rhetoric. Nevertheless, his goal remains clear: justice as harmony, an order in which reason rules over desire. Underscore 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 underscore. The importance of the theory of ideas. Plato's theory of ideas has had a profound influence on philosophy. It raises fundamental questions. Do general concepts exist independently of individual things? Are there objective moral values? Is truth relative or absolute? Many later thinkers will criticize his theory. Some reject the existence of independent ideas. Others reinterpret it. But even in the rejection, Plato's influence remains palpable. His philosophy combines metaphysics, epistemology, and politics into a coherent whole. Knowledge is not an end in itself, but the basis of just action. Education is not merely the absorption of information, but liberation. Underscore 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 underscore. The way out of the cave. The allegory of the cave remains a strong image to this day. It asks us to ask, do we perhaps live in a kind of cave ourselves? Do we consider opinions to be knowledge? Are we confusing shadows with reality? Plato sees philosophy as ascent. It is an arduous, often painful process. The path into the light is dazzling at first, but only through this path can true knowledge arise. And knowledge obliges. Those who have recognized the good cannot withdraw into private bliss. He has to take responsibility. Underscore 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 underscore. Conclusion: the power of the idea. With Plato, philosophy reaches a new depth. The question of being becomes the question of true being. Ethics is embedded in a metaphysical order. Politics becomes an applied epistemology. The visible world is not everything. Behind it is an invisible structure. Knowledge is more than opinion. Justice is more than convention. Plato opens up a perspective that goes beyond what can be directly experienced. He demands that we do not stop at the shadows, but have the courage to turn around. In the next chapter, his pupil Aristotle will continue on this path in his own way, and at the same time correct it. He will not transfer the ideas to a world of his own, but bring them back into the things themselves. But before we take this step, Plato's enduring challenge remains. What is really, and how can we recognize it? Chapter 5. Aristotle. Systematic thinking. With Aristotle, a thinker enters the stage who orders philosophy in a new way. While his teacher Plato divided reality into two levels, the sensual world and the world of ideas, Aristotle turns his gaze back to the concrete world. He does not stop at the ascent into a transcendent sphere, but examines what surrounds us with systematic precision. If Plato was the great visionary, then Aristotle is the great systematist. He was born in Stagira in 384 BC and entered Plato's academy as a young man. He studied and taught there for 20 years. But after Plato's death, he went his own way. He founded his own school, the Lyceum, in Athens. In contrast to the academy, which was more dialogue-oriented, the Lyceum became a center of empirical research. Data was collected, animals were examined, constitutions were analyzed, natural phenomena were observed. Aristotle didn't just want to speculate, he wanted to order, classify, explain. Underscore 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 underscore. Logic, the tool of thought. Aristotle is the founder of formal logic as an independent discipline. While Socrates clarified terms in conversation and Plato argued dialectically, Aristotle developed a method to test valid conclusions. His most famous instrument is the syllogism. A simple example is, all people are mortal. Socrates is a human being. So Socrates is mortal. Here it becomes clear, if the premises are true and the form is correct, the conclusion necessarily follows. Aristotle is interested in this form of necessity. He asks, when does a statement necessarily follow from other statements? In doing so, he created a tool that would shape science for centuries. Logic becomes the basis of rational argumentation. For Aristotle, however, logic is not an end in itself. It is the instrument, the organon, with which we structure knowledge. Underscore 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 underscore. Metaphysics, the question of being. Aristotle takes over the question of being from his predecessors, but he answers it differently than Plato. For him, there are no ideas in a world of their own. The form of a thing is not separate from it, but realized in itself. A tree is not just an imperfect reflection of an ideal tree shape. It is a concrete unity of matter and form. This doctrine is called hylomorphism. Everything that exists consists of matter, hyle, and form, morphe. Matter is potential, form is destiny. A marble block contains the possibility of a statue. It is only through the form that mere material becomes a certain thing. Here Aristotle introduces a central distinction: potency and act. Potency denotes possibility, act denotes realization. A seed is potentially a tree. The full-grown tree is the update of this possibility. Aristotle explains movement and change as the transition from potency to act. In doing so, he solves the problem that preoccupied Heraclitus and Parmenides. Change is possible without something emerging from absolutely nothing. Only one possibility is realized. Underscore 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 underscore. The four causes. To fully explain things, it is not enough for Aristotle to give just one cause. He distinguishes four causes. 1. The cause of substance, what something is made of. 2. The form cause, what makes it what it is. 3. The cause of action, what causes it. 4. The end cause, what it exists for. A house, for example, consists of bricks, material cause, has a certain construction form cause, is built by construction workers, effective cause, and is used for living, functional cause. Especially the purpose cause is decisive for Aristotle. He recognizes purposefulness in nature. A seed strives for the tree, a living being strives for the development of its abilities. This teleology, thinking in terms of purposes, shapes his philosophy of nature. Underscore 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 underscore. Natural philosophy, the order of the world. Aristotle examines plants, animals, movement, heaven and earth. He classifies living beings, describes their functions, and distinguishes between different types of souls. Plants have a vegetative soul, they grow and feed themselves. Animals also have a sensual soul, they perceive and move. In addition, man has a rational soul, he can think. In Aristotle's work, nature appears to be hierarchically ordered. Everything strives for the realization of its specific form. This striving is not a conscious plan, but an inner tendency. The universe itself is also ordered for him. Above the changeable earthly world is the realm of the immutable celestial bodies. At the top is the unmoved mover, a principle of pure actuality, which itself remains unmoved, but acts as the goal of all striving. This unmoved mover is not a personal god in the mythological sense, but pure form, pure actuality. He thinks for himself, thinking of thinking. Underscore 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 underscore. Ethics, the good life. In ethics, Aristotle follows Socrates, but he develops a more nuanced theory. The central question is, what is the highest good of man? His answer, eudaimonia, often translated as happiness or a successful life. But this does not mean a fleeting feeling, but a fulfilled life in harmony with one's own nature. Man is a rational being. Therefore, his highest good consists in working according to reason. For Aristotle, virtues are attitudes that enable us to act correctly. They arise through habit. One does not become virtuous by mere knowledge, but by practice. His doctrine of the right measure is famous. Virtue lies between two extremes. Courage lies between cowardice and foolhardiness. Generosity lies between stinginess and waste. However, this measure is not a mathematical average, but situation-dependent. It requires practical wisdom, phronesis. For Aristotle, ethics is not an abstract study of rules, but an art of right action in concrete life. Underscore 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 underscore. Politics, man as a community being. For Aristotle, man is by nature a zoon politican, a community being. It is not realized in isolation, but in the polis. The state serves not only survival, but the good life. Politics is the art of creating conditions under which virtue can flourish. Aristotle analyzes different forms of government and distinguishes between good and degenerate forms. Monarchy can become tyranny, aristocracy can become oligarchy, democracy can become the rule of the masses without measure. In contrast to Plato, however, Aristotle does not design a utopian ideal state, but examines real constitutions. His thinking is less normative, more empirical. Underscore 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 underscore. System and unit. What distinguishes Aristotle is the connection of all areas. Logic, metaphysics, natural philosophy, ethics and politics form a coherent whole. The structure of reality, the structure of thought and the structure of action are related to each other. Everything is ordered, everything has a form, everything strives for realization. His work is encyclopedic. He lays the foundations for biology, physics, psychology, and political theory. Even though many of his scientific assumptions were later corrected, his methodological approach remained formative. Underscore 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 underscore. The difference to Plato. While Plato transferred ideas to a world of their own, Aristotle brings the form back into the things themselves. He criticizes the idea of separate ideas as an unnecessary duplication of reality. He stays closer to the experience. Knowledge begins with the senses, but it does not end there. Through abstraction, the mind recognizes the form in particular. Aristotle combines empiricism and reason with this. Underscore 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 underscore. Conclusion: the architecture of thought. With Aristotle, ancient philosophy reaches a new maturity. The big questions of his predecessors are not discarded, but integrated. The question of being becomes an analysis of substance, form, and purpose. The question of knowledge becomes logic. The question of the good life becomes virtue ethics. Aristotle builds an edifice of thought that will last for centuries. His writings were rediscovered in the Middle Ages and had a significant influence on scholasticism. Even modern sciences are part of a tradition that he helped to found. Where Plato directed his gaze to heaven, Aristotle directed it to the earth. But both share the conviction that the world is understandable. The classical phase of Greek philosophy does not end with Aristotle, but it reaches a peak of systematic clarity. In the next chapter, thinking will change again. After the big systems, schools emerge that focus more on individual life, on serenity, lust, freedom from fear. The question remains, how should one live? But the answers are becoming more diverse. Chapter 6. Hellenistic Schools, Happiness and Serenity. With the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, a new era began, the Hellenistic period. The Greek world is changing fundamentally. The classical polis is losing political importance. Great empires are emerging, cultures are mixing, traditional securities are crumbling. The individual no longer stands within the manageable framework of the urban community, but in a wide, often confusing world. These political and cultural upheavals also have an impact on philosophy. While Plato and Aristotle had designed comprehensive systems, the focus is now shifting. The question is no longer primarily, what is the structure of reality? But, how can people live happily in an uncertain world? Philosophy becomes an art of living. During this time, several schools were created, each of which gave its own answer to the question of the good life. Three of them became particularly influential: the Stoic, Epicureanism, and Skepticism. Despite their differences, they share a common attitude. They seek inner peace in a world of external instability. The Stoa, founded by Zenon of Kition, teaches that the highest good lies in harmony with nature. But nature here does not only mean external environment, but the rational order of the cosmos. The Stoics take up the idea of an all-encompassing logo. The world is permeated by rational structure. Everything is done according to necessity. Chance is just a name for ignorance. If the world follows a rational order, then wisdom consists in accepting that order. Suffering does not arise from events themselves, but from our judgments about them. A loss, an illness, an insult, all these are external events. Whether they shake us depends on how we evaluate them. The Stoics therefore distinguish between what is in our power and what is beyond our control. In our power are our judgments, our attitudes, our will. Wealth, reputation, health, or the behavior of other people are not in our power. Happiness comes when we focus our attention on what we can influence and take everything else in stride. The Stoics call this attitude apatheia, freedom from passionate excitement. This does not mean callousness, but independence from destructive affects. Those who understand that everything is part of a larger order can maintain inner peace even in misfortune. The wise man is free for the Stoics, even if he is outwardly unfree. Freedom is an inner attitude. Virtue is the only true good. Everything else is indifferent, neither good nor bad in itself. Health is desirable, but not necessary for a successful life. The decisive factor is agreement with reason. This radical focus on internal autonomy makes the Stoa particularly attractive in times of crisis. In a world of political instability, it offers a form of intellectual independence. Later, it will also be widely used in the Roman Empire. At first, Epicurus doctrine sounds quite different. While the Stoics speak of duty, reason, and cosmic order, Epicureanism starts with the pleasure principle. For Epicurus, lust is the highest good, but not in the sense of excessive self-indulgence. His philosophy is often misunderstood. Epicurus defines pleasure primarily negatively, as the absence of pain and restlessness. The goal of life is ataraxia, peace of mind. This does not arise through excessive satisfaction of desires, but through wise selection. Epicurus distinguishes between natural and necessary needs, natural but not necessary needs, and unnecessary, artificial desires. Food and friendship belong to the first category, luxury and fame to the last. Those who limit their needs to what is necessary become more independent. A simple life can be happier than a life full of ambitions. For Epicurus, fear is the greatest source of suffering, especially the fear of the gods and death. Epicurus adopts an atomistic theory. Everything consists of atoms and empty space. The world does not come into being through divine guidance, but through natural processes. The gods may exist, but they don't care about human affairs. Death also loses its horror. As long as we live, death is not there. When death is there, we are no more. There is no further life, no punishment, no suffering. This insight is intended to liberate. Friendship plays a central role in Epicureanism. In small communities of like-minded people, people sought a secluded, quiet life. Politics tended to be avoided because it brings unrest and danger. In contrast to the Stoa, which can affirm engagement in public life, Epicurus recommends restraint. Happiness does not come from shaping the world, but from inner and interpersonal harmony. Skepticism, on the other hand, takes a third path. Its representatives doubt that certain knowledge can be achieved at all. In the face of contradictory philosophies and opinions, they plead for restraint in judgment. Instead of making dogmatic claims, skeptics practice epiche, abstaining from the final verdict. For every thesis, a counter-thesis can be found. When we realize that our beliefs are uncertain, we can free ourselves from the compulsion to achieve absolute certainty. Paradoxically, it is precisely this restraint that leads to peace of mind. If I don't claim to have the truth, I don't have to defend it. If I accept that many things are unclear, I lose the fear of being wrong. Skepticism is thus less a theory than an attitude. He teaches spiritual modesty. Instead of striving for definitive answers, he practices the balance between possibilities. Despite their differences, these schools are united by a common goal: ataraxia, serenity. In a world that has become politically fragmented and culturally diverse, they seek stability within man. The philosophy is becoming more personal. It is no longer primarily a theoretical building, but a guide to life. Questions of cosmology or metaphysics recede into the background or only serve as practical orientation. Different strategies emerge in the process. The Stoics rely on acceptance of necessity. The Epicureans to clever lust and freedom from fear. The skeptics on abstention. All three schools take the suffering seriously. They recognize that people are vulnerable, physically, emotionally, socially. But they do not react with despair, but with mental discipline. In the background is a new experience. The individual is less embedded in a stable community than before. Identity is becoming more fragile. Philosophy responds to this with inner self-sufficiency. One could say that while Plato focused on the idea of the good and Aristotle systematized the order of the world, the Hellenistic schools focused on the concrete existence of the individual. How do I deal with loss? How with fear? How with uncertainty? These questions are timeless. The Stoa reminds us to distinguish between the controllable and the uncontrollable. Epicureanism believes that simplicity and friendship can be greater sources of happiness than power and wealth. The skepticism that certainty is often overestimated and modesty can have a liberating effect. With these philosophies of life, thinking becomes an exercise. Philosophy is not only discussion, but practice. It calls for introspection, discipline, clarity. The Hellenistic epoch thus shows a new dimension of philosophical thought. It is no longer just about truth, but about leading a life. Knowledge should not only explain, but heal. In the next phase of history, philosophy will change again. It will meet new religious currents and deal with questions of faith. But the impulse remains: how can people find peace in an uncertain world? The Hellenistic schools give 3 different answers to this question, and each of them still resonates today. Chapter 7. Philosophy in the Roman Empire, Seneca, Cicero, and the practical art of living. When political power passed from Greece to Rome, the philosophical legacy also moved on. But in Rome, the tone is changing. While the Greeks designed large metaphysical systems and founded schools, philosophy in the Roman Empire became more of a practical way of life, an art of standing firm in everyday life, in politics and power, in wealth and danger. Rome was not a place of speculative seclusion. It was an empire characterized by expansion, administration, intrigue, and power struggles. In this world, philosophy had to be able to exist without withdrawing from public life. It became an inner armor. Two figures in particular stand for this development: Cicero and Seneca. Both were not secluded thinkers, but politicians, orators, advisors, men at the center of power. Her philosophy did not emerge in an ivory tower, but in the field of tension between responsibility and risk. Cicero lived in a time when the Roman Republic was falling apart. Civil wars, power struggles between Caesar and Pompey, political uncertainty shaped his life. As an orator and statesman, he tried to defend republican ideals. But he knew how fragile political orders can be. For Cicero, philosophy was not unworldly speculation, but the basis of political morality. He translated Greek ideas, especially from the Stoa and the Academy, into Latin and thus made them accessible to a new audience. He was less concerned with original theories than with mediation and application. He understood philosophy as the formation of character. For him, virtue was a prerequisite for any good state order. A just state needs just citizens, and just citizens are not created by laws alone, but by inner attitude. Cicero emphasized the importance of natural law, the idea that there is a rational order that underlies all positive laws. This order is universal, not bound by place or time. What is reasonable is also just. This idea will later have an enormous effect. The idea that there are overarching moral principles that limit even state power forms a basis for modern legal conceptions. But Cicero's life also shows the fragility of political ideals. After the Second Triumvirate came to power, he was declared an enemy of the state and finally executed. His philosophical conviction that virtue must endure even in defeat became an existential test. This connection between philosophy and life becomes even more insistent in Seneca. He lived in the 1st century AD, under the rule of the Roman emperors. As an advisor to Nero, he found himself at the center of an increasingly authoritarian power structure. Seneca was a Stoic, but his writings do not show cold severity, but an intense confrontation with fear, anger, death, and transience. He wrote letters, essays, and treatises that address the reader directly, often in a personal tone. For Seneca, philosophy is a daily exercise. It should help to examine one's own life, curb passions, and develop serenity. Unlike abstract theories, his attention is focused on concrete situations. How do I deal with insults? How to deal with loss? What about the fear of death? Death is a central theme. Seneca repeatedly emphasizes that death is not an evil, but a natural conclusion. Those who fear death live unfree. Those who accept it gain inner independence. This attitude was not just theoretical. When Nero finally forced him to commit suicide, Seneca accepted his fate with stoic calm. We do not know whether this calm was complete, but his death became a symbol of philosophical steadfastness. At the center of his teaching is control over one's own judgment. Events themselves are neutral. Only our evaluation makes them happiness or misfortune. This idea ties in with the Greek Stoa, but in Rome it becomes a practical way of life for people in political and social tensions. Seneca was aware of the contradictions of his life. As a rich man, he preached moderation. As a politician, he spoke of inner freedom. His writings openly show this inner conflict. For him, philosophy is not a state of perfection, but a path of self-correction. In addition to Cicero and Seneca, another figure also shaped Roman thought, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. In his self-reflections, he reflects on transience, duty and cosmic order. This is not a professor speaking, but a ruler who is thinking about the meaning of serenity in the middle of the war. This combination of power and self-reflection is typical of Roman philosophy. It is less about speculative originality than about practice. Philosophy becomes the technique of life. Roman thought adopts many Greek ideas, but it changes their character. While the Greeks often worked out theoretical differentiations, Rome is interested in application. How do you stay with integrity in a corrupt environment? How do you maintain dignity in exile? How do you stay calm in the face of political violence? The answer lies in the inner attitude. Stoicism became the dominant current in the Roman Empire because it promised a form of intellectual independence. In an empire that is constantly expanding and at the same time characterized by uncertainty, the idea of a cosmic order offers stability. At the same time, a new sensitivity for individuality is emerging. The form of the letter, the self-reflection, the personal address show, philosophy is not only aimed at citizens or statesmen, but at the individual. Another characteristic of Roman philosophy is its moral seriousness. Virtue is not an abstract ideal, but concrete discipline. It shows itself in dealing with wealth, with power, with loss. In contrast to Epicureanism, which tends to avoid political engagement, Roman Stoics emphasize responsibility in public life. You can't always choose which world you live in, but you can choose how you act in it. Philosophy thus becomes an inner fortress, an image that is often taken up later. The outer world may storm, but the inner world remains steadfast. This attitude influences not only later Christianity, but also modern ethics. Terms such as duty, conscience, universal reason bear Roman traces. At the same time, there is a certain melancholy in Roman thought. The size of the empire contrasts with the transience of human life. Triumphal processions and political intrigues alternate with exile, and death. Perhaps this is precisely why the question of the good life is gaining new urgency. Philosophy is not luxury, but necessity. Over time, the Roman Empire became more religiously diverse. New cults, mystery religions, and finally Christianity are added. Philosophy begins to deal with questions of faith. But before this transition is made, the Roman heritage remains clear. Thought should shape life. Virtue is reason in practice. Serenity is not a coincidence, but the result of daily practice. Cicero stands for the combination of philosophy and political responsibility. Seneca stands for the combination of philosophy and inner self-examination. Both show that thought and action are inseparable. In the Roman Empire, philosophy became an art of living under conditions of power and uncertainty. She doesn't lose any of her seriousness, but she gains closeness to everyday life. With the decline of the empire and the rise of Christianity, the focus will shift again. The question of virtue remains, but it is now placed in relation to revelation and faith. Philosophy enters into a new dialogue with religion. Chapter 8. Philosophy in the Middle Ages, Faith and Reason. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the intellectual landscape of Europe changed fundamentally. Political structures are breaking apart, new empires are emerging, cultural centers are shifting. But while external orders fluctuate, another power gains stability: Christianity. It became the most formative intellectual force of the Middle Ages. The great questions of philosophy, about truth, being, good, and meaning, are now posed in the horizon of faith. Philosophy does not disappear, but it enters into a new relationship with theology. The central question is, how do faith and reason relate to each other? Do they complement each other? Are they contradictory? Or is reason subordinate to faith? In the early Middle Ages, one figure in particular shaped this tension: Augustine. He lives in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, in a time of transition. The ancient world is coming to an end, a new order is emerging. Augustine is deeply rooted in classical education, especially Neoplatonism, and at the same time a passionate Christian thinker. His spiritual journey is itself a philosophical drama. In his Confessions, he describes how he searches for truth for a long time, in rhetoric, in various religious currents, in philosophical schools, until he finds an answer in Christianity that appeals to both his mind and his heart. For Augustine, truth is not merely abstract knowledge. It is an encounter with God. But this encounter does not contradict reason. On the contrary, faith seeks understanding. I believe in order to understand. This thought sums up his attitude. Unlike many ancient philosophers, who thought of the highest as an impersonal principle, Augustine understands God as a living reality. Nevertheless, he remains philosophically precise. He asks about the nature of time, about the nature of evil, about the structure of the soul. His famous analysis of time shows the depth of his thinking. The past no longer exists, the future does not yet exist, and the present is constantly eluding. Time is not an outer container, but an experience within consciousness. In this way, Augustine shifts philosophical attention inwards. The truth is sought within. He does not interpret evil as an independent power, but as a lack of good. Everything that exists is good insofar as it was created by God. Evil is not its own being, but deviation, lack, distortion. This solution combines metaphysical considerations with theological conviction. Augustine had a lasting influence on medieval thought. It shows that philosophical reflection and religious faith do not have to be enemies. Reason is a tool to deepen faith. But over the centuries, the relationship becomes more complex. New texts are discovered, especially the writings of Aristotle, which reach Europe via Arab scholars. These texts bring with them a systematic philosophy that is not directly influenced by Christianity. This is where scholasticism begins. The term is derived from school and refers to a method of thinking that is cultivated at the newly emerging universities. Scholastic philosophy is characterized by precise conceptual analysis, structured argumentation, and the systematic treatment of objections. The focus is on the question: how can the truths of faith be reconciled with reason? One of the most important figures of this era is Thomas Aquinas. He lives in the 13th century and is faced with the task of combining Aristotelian thought with Christian doctrine. Thomas assumes that truth is a unity. If God is the source of all truth, then true philosophical knowledge cannot contradict revelation. But he carefully distinguishes between what reason can know by its own power and what is accessible only through revelation. He considers the existence of God, for example, to be reasonably provable. In his famous 5 ways, he argues from motion, causality, contingency, stages of perfection and order in nature to a first principle. These arguments are not mere creeds, but rationally structured arguments. At the same time, Thomas acknowledges that central beliefs, such as the Trinity, cannot be deduced by reason alone. Faith remains necessary here. This differentiation is crucial. Reason acquires its own dignity. She is not only a servant, but a partner of faith. Thomas adopts from Aristotle the doctrine of form and matter, of potency and act, of purpose causes. But he integrates them into a Christian worldview. For him, God is a pure act, perfect being, the origin and goal of all things. The world is not random, but meaningfully ordered. Man possesses reason and free will. Moral action consists in recognizing the natural law and following it. Natural law is further elaborated by Thomas. It is an expression of divine reason in man. Those who act rationally also follow God's order. The scholastic method develops a special form of argumentation. In so-called questions, questions are asked, objections are collected, counterarguments are formulated, and finally a solution is presented. This dialectical structure forces precision. The Middle Ages are often portrayed as dogmatic and uncritical. But the scholastic tradition shows an astonishing intellectual discipline. Contradictions are taken seriously, positions are carefully examined. At the same time, theology remains the overarching framework. Philosophy serves to clarify and defend faith. However, this does not mean that it is without independence. In addition to Augustine and Thomas, numerous other currents emerged. Discussions about universals, i.e., the question of whether general concepts have independent reality, shape thinking. Realists, nominalists, and other positions struggle for the correct interpretation. In the background, there is always the question of the relationship between thought and reality. Do general entities really exist, or are they just names? These debates show that medieval thinking is anything but stagnant. At the same time, an intensive examination of Aristotle developed in Islamic and Jewish philosophy, which in turn had an influence on Christian thinkers. The Middle Ages are more intellectually networked than they often appear. However, the tension between faith and reason remains. Some emphasize the independence of philosophy, others the primacy of revelation. But despite all the differences, medieval philosophy is united by a common concern: the search for harmony between thought and faith. Augustine had shown the way inwards. Thomas builds a vast system in which reason and revelation work together. Scholasticism develops tools for precise argumentation. In the Middle Ages, philosophy was not a competitor to religion, but its dialogue partner. Truth is thought of as a unity, even if its approaches are different. With the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, this relationship will change again. Trust in the authority of tradition is questioned. The focus is more on people. New scientific methods are emerging, but the medieval struggle for faith and reason leaves a lasting legacy. It shows that thinking can also be critical and differentiated within the horizon of religious conviction. The question remains: how do faith and knowledge relate to each other? Is reason independent? Is revelation necessary? In the next chapter, the focus will be more on people themselves. Confidence in one's own cognitive power grows. The Renaissance heralds a new epoch, a time of new beginnings in which old certainties are re-examined. The search for truth continues, but it takes a new direction. Chapter 9. The Renaissance. Focus on the human being. With the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, it is not only the art, architecture, or politics of Europe that is changing, the self-image of people is changing. After centuries in which thought and faith were closely intertwined and theology dominated the intellectual horizon, an epoch begins that rediscovers man himself. The Renaissance, literally rebirth, sees itself as a return to antiquity, but at the same time it is a departure into a new era. At the center of this change is a changed perspective. Man is no longer regarded exclusively as a creature of God, whose highest destiny lies in the salvation of the beyond, but as an independent, creative, rational individual. This shift is not abrupt, but develops gradually. But it marks a profound intellectual upheaval. A driving force of this epoch is humanism. Humanists are turning to ancient texts again, not only to interpret them theologically, but to read them as a source of secular education. Latin and Greek are studied, manuscripts are collected, classical authors are rediscovered. Education, then, means not only the interpretation of sacred texts, but the comprehensive training of human faculties. The human being appears as a being with dignity, freedom, and creative power. This new appreciation is particularly evident in a famous speech on the dignity of man, in which man is described as a creature that does not occupy a fixed place in creation, but can shape itself. While in the medieval worldview the order seemed hierarchically fixed, the Renaissance emphasizes the openness of human possibilities. This idea also changes the understanding of knowledge. Scholasticism had relied heavily on logical analysis and authority. In the Renaissance, interest in direct observation and practical experience grew. Nature is no longer considered only within the framework of theological categories, but as an independent object of investigation. This is where the development of new sciences begins. Astronomy, anatomy, physics, and mathematics are experiencing an upswing. The world is no longer interpreted exclusively symbolically, but empirically researched. The gaze is directed towards the sky, and at the same time into the human body. This new attitude leads to conflicts with traditional teachings. When observation and calculation lead to results that deviate from traditional authorities, tension arises. But it is precisely in this tension that a new self-confidence of thought develops. The Renaissance is therefore not only rediscovery, but emancipation. Man increasingly trusts in his own reason. He begins to understand the world as malleable. This development is also evident in political philosophy. While in the Middle Ages rule was often understood as an order ordained by God, Renaissance thinkers analyzed political power soberly and realistically. Politics is no longer evaluated exclusively morally or theologically, but is regarded as an independent area of human action. The individual emerges more strongly. Artists sign their works, scholars formulate their own theories, explorers dare to travel to unknown territories. The discovery of new continents not only broadens geographical horizons, but also shakes up the previous view of the world. Europe is no longer the self-evident center of a closed world. With the invention of the printing press, ideas spread faster than ever before. Knowledge is becoming more accessible. Education is no longer taught exclusively in monasteries or universities, but reaches broader strata of society. All these developments contribute to a new self-image. People are not only part of a predetermined order, but also an active designer. But this departure also brings uncertainty. When traditional certainties disappear, a space of freedom emerges, but also of disorientation. The question of truth is posed anew. Is truth guaranteed by authority, or must it be achieved through one's own knowledge? The Renaissance responds with confidence in human reason. But this trust is not limitless. Many thinkers remain religiously rooted. The epoch is not a rejection of faith, but a readjustment of its relationship to the world. At the same time, a new understanding of nature is emerging. While in the Middle Ages the world was often read symbolically as an indication of divine truths, it is now beginning to be understood as a mechanically structured system. Mathematics becomes the language of the description of nature. This development prepares the ground for the scientific revolution. The idea that the laws of nature can be discovered through observation and experiment is gaining strength. The world is becoming predictable. But the Renaissance is more than the beginning of modern science. It is also a cultural and aesthetic movement. Art and philosophy interpenetrate. The depiction of the human body with realistic precision reflects the new appreciation of the individual. Perspective in painting symbolizes a changed view of reality. The viewer's point of view becomes decisive. This emphasis on the individual leads to a new awareness of subjectivity. The self becomes the theme. Autobiographical writings are created. Personal experiences are reflected. People see themselves not only as part of a community, but as an independent center of perception and decision. At the same time, interest in education as self-formation is growing. The educated person should not only possess theological knowledge, but also develop rhetorical skills, historical understanding, and moral judgment. Education becomes the cultivation of the personality. The Renaissance thus brought forth a new anthropology. Man is free, capable of learning, creative. It is not determined exclusively by sin or providence, but by one's own decisions. But this freedom is ambivalent. When the human being becomes the standard, the question of limits arises. What does responsibility mean in a world that is no longer clearly hierarchically ordered? How can moral orientation be secured? These questions will shape the following centuries. The Renaissance opens up space, but it does not provide all the answers. Another central element is the revival of skepticism. The encounter with different cultures, opinions, and scientific theories leads to doubts about absolute certainties. If there are so many perspectives, how can you be sure? Doubt is no longer seen as a danger, but as an engine of knowledge. This attitude paves the way for the methodological doubt of the modern era. Overall, the Renaissance marked a turning point. The world was no longer understood exclusively as a divinely fixed order, but as an open field of human knowledge and design. Humanism does not mean egocentricity, but recognition of human dignity. People are taken seriously in their ability to think, create, and act. This new spirit of departure will soon lead to systematic philosophical programs. Trust in reason and science will be further expanded. At the same time, the question of the basis of reliable knowledge is becoming increasingly urgent. With the Renaissance, the Middle Ages did not end abruptly, but entered a new phase. Tradition and innovation stand side by side. Faith and reason are being rebalanced. In the next chapter, this movement will be continued. The question of the source of knowledge, whether it lies in reason itself or in experience, becomes the central point of contention. But the decisive impulse has already been set. The human being is taking center stage. He asks not only about God or the world, but about himself as a thinking subject. The Renaissance is thus not only a rebirth of antiquity, but the birth of modernity. Chapter 10. Rationalism and Empiricism, the dispute over knowledge. With the Renaissance, trust in human reason had grown. New scientific discoveries had shown that nature can be described mathematically. Traditional authorities were questioned. But with this departure, a fundamental question arose with new urgency. Where does our knowledge come from? Is it reason itself that provides us with certain knowledge? Or does all knowledge ultimately spring from experience? In the 17th and 18th centuries, this question came to a head in a fundamental philosophical conflict, the dispute between rationalism and empiricism. It is about nothing less than the basis of knowledge. The rationalists are convinced that true knowledge comes from reason. Experience can be deceiving. Only clear and distinct thinking leads to certainty. The empiricists, on the other hand, consider the senses to be the source of all ideas. The mind begins empty, and only experience inscribes itself in it. At the beginning of rationalism is René Descartes. He lives in a time of scientific revolution in which old world views are breaking down. Uncertainty shapes thinking. Descartes is looking for a firm foundation that stands up to all doubt. His path is radical. He decides to doubt everything that can be doubted. Sensory perceptions can be deceiving. Dreams can hardly be distinguished from reality. Even mathematical beliefs could, so he imagines, be manipulated by a powerful deceiver. But in radical doubt he discovers a point that cannot be shaken. When I doubt, I think. And when I think, I exist. The famous "I think, therefore I am" is not a logical conclusion, but an immediate insight. The existence of the thinking ego is indisputable. From this point, Descartes tries to rebuild knowledge. He distinguishes between residential cogitans, the thinking spirit, and residential extensa, the extended matter. Mind and body are two different substances. For Descartes, certain ideas are innate. The idea of expansion, number, or even the idea of God do not come from experience, but are anchored in the spirit itself. Clear and distinct insights gained through pure reason are certain. Mathematics becomes a role model. Just as geometric truths are derived from axioms, philosophical knowledge should also be built up. Knowledge is deductive, logically structured. But rationalism does not end with Descartes. Baruch Spinoza takes the thought even further. For him, there are not two substances, but only one, God or nature. Everything that exists is an expression of this one substance. Spinoza thinks of the world in strict necessity. Freedom does not consist in arbitrary action, but in understanding necessity. The more we realize, the freer we become, because we understand the causes of our actions. Spinoza also orients himself towards geometry. His ethics is structured like a mathematical textbook, with definitions, axioms, and proofs. For him, knowledge is a rational penetration of reality. Rationalism trusts in the power of thought. He assumes that the structure of the world corresponds to the structure of reason. Truth is not merely subjective opinion, but objective insight. But on the other side of the Channel, in England, a different tradition is developing. John Locke questions the idea of innate knowledge. The human mind, he argues, is like a blank page at the beginning, a tabula rasa. All ideas come from experience. This experience has two sources: external perception and inner reflection. We perceive colors, sounds, shapes. We observe our own thought processes. Complex terms emerge from these impressions. Locke distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities such as expansion or movement belong to the things themselves, while secondary qualities such as color or taste only arise in perception. For Locke, knowledge is limited. We can only know what is accessible through experience. Speculation about metaphysical substances is problematic if it is not based on observation. David Hume formulates empiricism even more radically. For him, all the contents of our mind consist of impressions and ideas. Impressions are immediate sensory experiences. Ideas are attenuated copies of these impressions. If we can't trace a concept back to an impression, it's empty. Hume also directs this method against central philosophical concepts. What is the idea of cause and effect? We observe that events follow one another on a regular basis. But we never see a necessary connection. The assumption that the future will resemble the past is not based on logical certainty, but on habit. This insight shakes the foundation of certain knowledge. If even causality cannot be rationally justified, what remains? Hume also doubts the idea of a stable self. When we look inside ourselves, we find only a sequence of perceptions, not an unchanging substance. The ego is a bundle of impressions. Empiricism thus leads to a certain skepticism. If all knowledge comes from experience and experience never provides absolute necessity, certainty remains limited. There are two opposing positions here. The rationalists seek security in reason. The empiricists anchor knowledge in experience. Both traditions have strong arguments, and both reach their limits. Rationalism threatens to distance itself from reality if it relies too much on innate ideas. Empiricism gets into trouble when it is supposed to explain necessity and universality. The dispute over the source of knowledge is not just a technical debate. It concerns the self-image of the human being. Is the mind actively structuring or passively receiving? Is truth anchored in thought itself or in the world of experience? These questions shape the entire modern era. They lead to new methods, to scientific progress, but also to philosophical crises. Towards the end of the 18th century, a thinker will try to overcome these contradictions. He will assert that both experience and reason are necessary, and that our mind itself sets conditions for the possibility of knowledge. But before this synthesis occurs, the tension remains. Rationalism has strengthened the self-confidence of reason. Empiricism has emphasized the importance of experience and critically examined metaphysical speculation. Together, they have placed epistemology at the center of philosophy. The question is no longer just what is, but how we know what is. This change of perspective marks the beginning of a new phase of thinking. The world is no longer simply assumed, but examined for its recognizability. In the next chapter, this dispute will take a surprising turn. The question of the source of knowledge is posed anew, not as an either-or, but as a question about the conditions under which experience is possible at all. The conflict between rationalism and empiricism has prepared the ground. Now attempts are being made to bridge it. Chapter 11. Immanuel Kant, the Copernican turn. The dispute between rationalism and empiricism had led philosophy to a critical point. The rationalists trusted in reason as the source of necessary truths, the empiricists in experience as the origin of all knowledge. But both positions seemed incomplete. Either one threatened to lose oneself in abstract speculation, or one ended up in a skepticism that shook even basic certainties. At this point, Immanuel Kant enters the scene. He describes his own project as a Copernican turn in thinking. Just as Copernicus changed the perspective by no longer assuming that the sun revolves around the earth, but that the earth revolves around the sun, Kant proposes to pose the question of knowledge anew. Until now, it had been assumed that our knowledge had to be based on the objects. Kant, on the other hand, asks, what if the objects are based on the structure of our cognitive capacity? This shift is radical. It does not mean that the world is merely an invention of our mind, but it claims that we never know the world in itself, but only as it appears to us, shaped by the conditions of our thinking. Kant begins with a simple observation. Experience alone does not provide us with a need. When we observe that one event follows another, we see only the sequence, not the necessity. And yet we speak of natural laws, of general and necessary connections. Where does this necessity come from? Kant distinguishes between analytical and synthetic judgments. Analytical judgments only explain what is already contained in the term. Synthetic judgments expand our knowledge. Synthetic judgments a priori are particularly important to him, i.e., judgments that expand our knowledge and at the same time apply independently of experience. For him, mathematics and fundamental laws of nature belong to this category. But how are such judgments possible? It was here that Kant developed his transcendental philosophy. He does not examine individual objects, but the conditions of the possibility of experience. For him, space and time are not properties of things in themselves, but forms of our perception. They are structures of our ability to perceive. Everything we experience seems necessary to us in space and time. In addition, the mind has basic concepts, categories, through which we order impressions. Terms such as cause, substance, or unity are not derived from experience, but conditions for experience to be possible at all. Thus, when we speak of causality, we are not projecting a mere habit into the world, as Hume suggested, but we are actively structuring our perception through the category of cause. The world as we know it is therefore the result of an interplay of sensuality and reason. Without sensuality there would be no content, without reason there would be no order. Kant makes a sharp distinction between appearance and thing in itself. Appearance is the world as it is accessible to us through our cognitive structures. The thing itself, on the other hand, remains hidden from us. We cannot know how things are independent of our perception. This limitation is central. Kant sets limits to reason. It must not presume to judge things that lie beyond possible experience. In traditional metaphysics, attempts have been made to prove theoretically the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, or the freedom of the will. Kant shows that such proofs exceed the limits of possible experience. Pure reason gets into contradictions here, into so-called antinomies. But Kant is not a skeptic in the sense of a total negation. It limits knowledge in order to give space to faith, not in the sense of blind acceptance, however, but as a practical necessity. This is where his moral philosophy begins. For Kant, morality is not dependent on inclination, luck, or consequences. It is based solely on reason. The central idea is, act only according to the maxim that you can want to become a general law. This categorical imperative is not a hypothetical if-then commandment, but an unconditional demand. Moral action is not based on personal advantage, but on general validity. For example, when I think about lying, I have to ask, could I want lying to be a general law? Would communication still work then? If not, the maxim contradicts itself. Morality is based on autonomy. Man is not moral when he acts out of fear of punishment or hope of reward, but when he acts out of respect for the moral law he gives himself. This idea gives man a new dignity. It is not only part of natural causality, but at the same time a member of a realm of ends, in which every rational being is an end in itself. Kant thus combines freedom with morality. Freedom is not arbitrariness, but self-legislation of reason. In theoretical knowledge, man appears as part of nature. In practical reason, he experiences himself as free. This dichotomy is complex, but crucial. Kant does not claim that we can prove freedom empirically, but it presupposes moral action. Without freedom, there would be no responsibility. In this way, Kant limits theoretical reason in order to secure practical reason. His work is systematically structured. In the Critique of Pure Reason, he examines the conditions of knowledge. In the Critique of Practical Reason, he analyzes morality. In the Critique of Judgment, he devotes himself to aesthetics and teleology. In Aesthetics, he describes beauty as disinterested pleasure. An aesthetic judgment is subjective, but it claims universality. Here, too, his effort to combine subjective experience and general validity is evident. Kant's philosophy is demanding, but its core is clear: man is not merely a passive recipient of impressions. He is an active co-creator of the world of experience. Knowledge is possible because our mind structures the world. At the same time, this structure is limited. We cannot go beyond what our forms of knowledge allow. Metaphysics as a speculative science is critically examined. This critical attitude profoundly shapes modern philosophy. Kant shows that reason must examine itself before it judges the world. His Copernican turn thus consists in turning the question, not how the world is independent of us, but how it is possible for us. This perspective changes everything. It influences idealism, existentialism, phenomenology, and many other currents. At the same time, Kant remains in the field of tension between freedom and nature, knowledge and faith, autonomy and duty. He claims to put philosophy on a secure foundation without falling into dogmatism. He wants to save science and at the same time establish morality. With Kant, the dispute between rationalism and empiricism does not simply end, it is transformed. Reason and experience are both necessary, but their relationship is redefined. In the next chapter, his successors will try to cross or continue the boundaries he has set. German idealism will rethink the relationship between spirit and reality. But the standard remains: critical self-examination of reason. Kant showed that knowledge is not only a question of content, but of conditions, and that freedom does not lie in external circumstances, but in the ability to give oneself a law. With him, philosophy enters modernity, self-confidently, critically, and at the same time aware of its own limits. Chapter 12. German Idealism, Spirit and Freedom. With Kant, philosophy had received a new foundation. Reason should become aware of its own conditions before judging the world. But his distinction between appearance and thing in itself left behind an open tension. If we only know things as they appear to us, what remains of the thing in itself? Is it just a borderline concept, or an insurmountable barrier? This is exactly where the thinkers of German idealism come in. They accept Kant's critical impulse, but want to overcome the split between knowledge and reality. Her central concern is not to think of mind and world as separate realms, but as an expression of a deeper unity. Freedom becomes the key concept in this. The first big step in this direction came from Johann Gottlieb Fichte. For him, the I is not merely a thinking subject that processes impressions, but an active principle. The ego posits itself. It is not simply present, but an act. Fichte radicalizes Kant's approach. While Kant still spoke of a thing in itself that lies outside our knowledge, Fichte declares, everything we experience is the product of the activity of the ego. The ego posits itself, and at the same time it posits a non-ego, a world that confronts it. This world is not an independent thing in itself, but a necessary resistance on which the ego unfolds. Without resistance, there would be no activity, no self-determination. The world is thus the stage and condition of freedom. Fichte's philosophy is dynamic. The ego is not static, but constantly in the process of self-determination. Freedom is not just a choice, but creative self-positioning. Morality becomes the task of shaping one's own actions in harmony with reason. But Fichte's emphasis on the self raises new questions. If everything is posited by the ego, isn't there a threat of a form of subjectivism? How can an objective nature be thought of that is not merely the product of subjective activity? This is where Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling enters the scene. He tries to think of nature and spirit as co-original. For Schelling, nature is not merely a passive object, but itself dynamic, creative. Nature is visible spirit, spirit is invisible nature. Schelling develops a philosophy of nature that understands the processes of nature as the expression of a living principle. The world is not a mechanical system, but organic. Everything strives for self-development. In this perspective, the separation between subject and object is relativized. Both are moments of a larger absolute. The absolute is not merely static unity, but creative movement. Schelling's thinking is strongly influenced by the idea of development. Art takes on a special meaning. In the work of art, he believes, the unity of nature and spirit can be experienced directly. Art is not a mere imitation, but a revelation of the absolute. But the most comprehensive and influential draft of German idealism comes from Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel wants to understand the whole of reality as a process of the spirit. For him, history is not a random sequence of events, but rational development. The central concept in Hegel is dialectics. Reality does not unfold in a straight line, but through tensions and contradictions. A position, a thesis, produces its opposite, an antithesis. Out of this conflict emerges a higher unity, a synthesis. This new unit contains elements of the previous positions, but overcomes them at a higher level. Dialectics is not an external scheme that is imposed on the world. It is the inner structure of reality itself. Contradiction is not a mere mistake, but the engine of development. For Hegel, the absolute is not static, but a process. The mind knows itself through history. In religion, art, philosophy, and politics, self-confidence unfolds. For Hegel, the history of mankind is a step forward in the consciousness of freedom. In the ancient world, only one person was free, the ruler. In later epochs, it is recognized that some are free. In the modern world, the insight should arise that all people are free. The state plays a central role in this. For Hegel, it is not merely an administrative apparatus, but the realization of objective freedom. It combines individual and general interests. This view is controversial, but it shows Hegel's conviction: freedom is not isolated subjectivity, but part of a rational order. Hegel's system is comprehensive. Logic, nature, spirit, everything is embedded in a development. For him, philosophy is the highest form of self-consciousness of the mind. In it, reality recognizes itself as reasonable. But it is precisely this system that provokes criticism. Can it really be said that history is necessarily reasonable? Are contradictions always productive? And is there room for individual experience in such a system? Despite all the criticism, German idealism has had a lasting influence on philosophy. It shifts the focus from the isolated subject to the historical and social dimension of the mind. Freedom is understood not only as a moral quality, but as a historical process. Fichte emphasizes the creative activity of the ego. Schelling seeks the unity of nature and spirit. Hegel thinks of the whole of reality as a dialectical development. What they have in common is the attempt to overcome Kant's separation between appearance and thing in itself. Reality should not be hidden behind experience, but should be opened up in thinking itself. Dialectics becomes the central instrument in this process. Contradiction is not a failure, but a necessary step on the way to higher insight. With German idealism, philosophy reaches a climax of systematic speculation. But at the same time, it is preparing new fractures. Some thinkers will question Hegel's optimism. They will emphasize that history does not necessarily run rationally, that freedom is not automatically realized. Others will criticize the emphasis on the spirit and put more emphasis on material or existential aspects. But the impulse remains: reality is not rigid, but a process. Freedom is not given, but is fought for, in thought, in action, in history. In the next chapter, thinking will shift again. The great systems of idealism are challenged by philosophers who emphasize the individual, existence, absurdity, or material reality. The mind is no longer understood as a harmonious process, but as torn, contradictory, sometimes desperate. But the question remains the same: how is freedom possible? German idealism has attempted a comprehensive answer to this, an answer that thinks of mind and world in a dynamic context. And even if later thinkers take different paths, the idea remains alive that reality is not merely given, but unfolds in thought and action. Chapter 13. Existentialism and Nihilism: Freedom, Fear, and Meaning. After the great systems of German idealism, distrust of comprehensive, all-explanatory designs grew in the 19th century. The idea that history proceeds rationally and that the mind recognizes itself in constant progress seems to many thinkers too optimistic, too abstract, too far removed from concrete life. The Industrial Revolution radically changes societies. Traditional ties are dissolved. Religion loses its self-evidentness. Political upheavals shake Europe. In this atmosphere, the individual comes to the fore with a new urgency, not as part of a harmonious whole, but as an isolated, searching being. Existentialism and nihilism arise from this experience of crisis. They no longer ask the question of the structure of reality in general, but of the meaning of individual life in a world without fixed metaphysical certainties. Freedom, fear, responsibility, and loss of meaning become central themes. One of the first thinkers to make this change of perspective is Soren Kierkegaard. He opposes the system philosophy of his time, especially Hegel's comprehensive interpretation of history. For Kierkegaard, it is not about objective totality, but about subjective existence. Truth is not just something you know, it is something you live. He distinguishes between different stages of life: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. In the aesthetic stage, man lives in the moment, seeks pleasure, avoidance of boredom, immediate satisfaction. But this life leads to emptiness because it knows no binding orientation. In the ethical stage, people take responsibility. He decides for obligation, for permanence, for moral self-determination. But here, too, a restlessness remains, because man recognizes his own inadequacy. Finally, for Kierkegaard, the religious stage means the leap into faith, a leap that cannot be rationally justified. Here the individual stands alone before God. Faith is not a logical conclusion, but an existential decision. A central concept in Kierkegaard's work is fear. Fear is not just fear of a concrete object, but a sense of possibility. Man realizes that he is free, and this freedom frightens him. Fear is the dizziness of freedom. It shows that we are not fixed, but have to choose. This emphasis on subjective decision marks a break with traditional metaphysics. Meaning is not predetermined, but arises in existential execution. A few decades later, Friedrich Nietzsche radicalized the diagnosis of modernity. With the famous statement "God is dead," he sums up an experience: the old values have lost their binding force. Christian morality, the metaphysical order, the idea of an objective meaning, all this is in question. Nietzsche understands this loss as a historical process. The Enlightenment, science, critical reason have undermined the foundations of faith. But the consequences of this upheaval have not yet been fully experienced. This is where nihilism begins, the experience that there is no absolute meaning, no ultimate truth, no overarching standard. If God is dead, who sets the values? For Nietzsche, nihilism is not only a danger, but also an opportunity. He distinguishes between passive and active nihilism. The passive nihilist resigns, falls into meaninglessness. The active nihilist, on the other hand, recognizes the emptiness of old values and creates new ones. For Nietzsche, the Superman is not a biological ideal, but a symbol of self-creation. People should not live according to predetermined norms, but set their own values. Life becomes an artistic design. Nietzsche also analyzes fear, but not so much as a religious category, but as a consequence of weakness and resentment. He criticizes moral systems that have arisen out of fear of life. Instead, he calls for affirmation, even in the face of suffering and transience. His idea of eternal return, the idea that everything repeats itself infinitely, is an existential test. Would you want to live your life the same way again? If so, then you say yes completely. With Nietzsche, the critique of traditional systems of meaning reaches a climax. But it does not provide a new objective morality, but demands creative self-responsibility. In the 20th century, thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre took up these questions and developed existentialism in its classical form. Sartre lives in a time of world wars, political violence, and existential threats. The experience of the absurdity of life becomes a collective reality. Sartre's famous phrase is, "Existence precedes essence." By this he means that man is not born with a fixed nature or destiny. He exists, and it is only through his decisions that he determines who he is. There is no divine plan, no predetermined morality. Man is condemned to freedom. Even non-decision is a decision. This radical freedom brings with it responsibility. When I vote, I am not only voting for myself, but I am setting an example for humanity. Responsibility is universal, but freedom is a burden. It creates fear. Not because something concrete is imminent, but because no external authority will take the decision away. Sartre speaks of abandonment. Man is alone with his freedom. In order to escape this burden, people tend to be insincere. They take refuge in roles, excuses, social expectations. But real existence demands authenticity, the conscious acceptance of one's own freedom. Sartre's existentialism is atheistic. There is no transcendent meaning. But it is precisely in this that he sees the dignity of the human being. Meaning comes from action. While Kierkegaard emphasizes the leap of faith, Nietzsche calls for self-creation and Sartre proclaims radical freedom. They are united by a common motive. Man alone is faced with the task of giving meaning to his life. Existentialism and nihilism arise from the experience of losing traditional certainties. They do not accept canned answers, but they differ in their attitude. Nihilism describes emptiness. Existentialism seeks responsibility in this emptiness. Freedom is not a romantic ideal, but a challenge. It means acting without metaphysical guarantees. The fear that accompanies this freedom is not pathological, but ontological. It is part of being human. At the same time, the question remains open. Is complete self-creation possible? Aren't there conditions, social, historical, biological, that limit our freedom? These questions will be discussed further in the further course of the philosophy. But with existentialism and nihilism, the focus finally shifts from the system to existence. The focus is no longer on the reasonableness of history, but on the responsibility of the individual. No longer the unity of the mind, but the experience of absurdity. Philosophy becomes more personal, more literary, more immediate. She doesn't just talk about concepts, but about fear, death, guilt, hope. In the next chapter, another branch of philosophy will develop, one that relies less on existential experience and more on language, logic, and analysis. But the questions of freedom and meaning remain. Because even in a world without guaranteed answers, man remains a being that asks, and has to decide. Chapter 14. Analytic Philosophy and Language Criticism, Wittgenstein, Russell, and the Philosophy of Language. While existentialism focused on the existential experience of the individual, a completely different philosophical current developed in the early 20th century. Instead of addressing freedom, fear, or loss of meaning, she turned her attention to a seemingly sober but fundamental problem: language. Many philosophical problems, according to the new conviction, arise from misunderstandings about how language works. Anyone who clears up these misunderstandings also solves seemingly deep metaphysical puzzles. This movement is called Analytic philosophy. Its origins lie primarily in the English-speaking world, but its roots go deeper, to the logic and mathematics of the 19th century. Their concern is clarity. Unclear terms, ambiguous statements, and rhetorical obfuscations are to be replaced by precise analysis. A key figure in this development is Bertrand Russell. He was a mathematician, logician, and philosopher at the same time. His goal was to logically secure the foundations of mathematics. Together with Alfred North Whitehead, he developed a monumental work that was intended to show that mathematical truths can be traced back to logical principles. Russell's interest in logic, however, was not purely formal. He was convinced that many philosophical problems arise from inaccurate language. When we expose the logical structure of statements, many apparent paradoxes disappear. A famous example is his essay on markings. The phrase "the present King of France is bald" seems to make sense, even though there is no current King of France. Russell analyzes the logical form of such sentences and shows that they are not simply meaningless, but have a certain structure. Precise analysis can clarify the conditions under which a sentence is true or false. This method, reducing complex statements to their logical structure, has had a lasting impact on analytic philosophy. Philosophy becomes language analysis. Ludwig Wittgenstein formulates the importance of language for philosophy even more radically. In his early work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he argues that the world is the totality of facts, not things. Language depicts these facts. A meaningful sentence is a logical picture of reality. The structure of language reflects the structure of the world. If a sentence makes sense, it must be verifiable in principle. Statements about ethics, aesthetics, or metaphysics cannot be presented as facts. Therefore, they are considered unspeakable in the strict sense. The Tractatus ends with the famous sentence, "What you can't talk about, you have to keep quiet about." Wittgenstein did not want to devalue ethics or religion, but to mark their special position. They are beyond what can be said. This view influences so-called logical positivism, a movement that seeks to distinguish scientific statements from metaphysical ones. Only empirically verifiable or logically necessary sentences are considered meaningful. Anything else is rejected as meaningless. But Wittgenstein himself later turned away from his early position. In his philosophical investigations, he develops a completely different view of language. He recognizes that language is not a uniform system of representation, but fulfills a wide range of functions. Language is not only a description of facts, but an action. We ask, command, promise, tell, joke, calculate, pray. Wittgenstein calls these different uses language games. Each language game has its own rules. Meaning is not created by illustration, but by use. The meaning of a word is its use in language. This shifts the focus from logical structure to social practice. Philosophical problems arise when we detach words from their everyday context and ascribe a supposedly deeper meaning to them. For example, when we ask, "What is time?" or "What is consciousness?" we easily get confused by concepts. Wittgenstein's later philosophy sees itself as therapeutic. It does not want to set up new theories, but to resolve confusions. The philosopher is supposed to work like a therapist who unravels the knot of language. This attitude fundamentally changes the self-image of philosophy. Instead of designing large systems, it is about precise analysis of concrete terms. Russell also remains convinced that clarity is the ultimate goal. Philosophy should approach the method of science, logical, argumentative, comprehensible. Analytic philosophy continues to develop in the 20th century. Topics such as logic, epistemology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language are systematically examined. But at its core, the conviction remains: many philosophical problems are language problems. When we understand the logical form of our statements, some seemingly profound questions are resolved. Others are reformulated, more precise, clearer, more argumentatively accessible. In contrast to existentialism, which often argues in literary and subjective terms, analytic philosophy attaches importance to argumentative rigor. Emotional or rhetorical elements take a back seat. However, this does not mean that it is only concerned with formal logic. Questions of consciousness, identity, morality, or truth are also dealt with, but with analytical tools. One example is the discussion about the relationship between mind and body. Instead of making metaphysical speculations, Philosophers analyze terms such as pain, thought, or experience, and ask how they are used in our language. The question of meaning is also examined in a differentiated way. What makes a sentence true? What does it mean to understand something? How do names, descriptions, index words work? This focus on language makes it clear that our thinking is inextricably linked to linguistic structures. We don't think independently of language, but in it. At the same time, criticism is being voiced. Some accuse analytic philosophy of losing itself in questions of detail and neglecting the existential or social dimensions of thought. But its strength lies precisely in its methodological clarity. It forces us to define terms, formulate arguments cleanly, and disclose implicit assumptions. In the course of the 20th century, analytic philosophy became increasingly diverse. Some thinkers turn back to metaphysical questions, others integrate findings from linguistics or cognitive science. But Wittgenstein's insight remains formative. Philosophy is not a theory about hidden realities, but a clarification of what we are already saying. With this criticism of language, the image of the philosopher also changes. He is no longer the system builder or existential prophet, but the analyst who works with conceptual precision. The transition to analytic philosophy does not mark a break with the past, but a new method. The question of truth remains, but it is addressed through the analysis of language. In the next and last chapter, the focus will be on the present. New challenges, technological developments, artificial intelligence, global ethics, challenge philosophy. But even there, language remains decisive. Because how we talk about these topics determines how we understand them. Analytic philosophy has shown that clarity does not mean superficiality. It is a prerequisite for thinking not to be lost in the fog of words. And so we come full circle, from the early questions of being to freedom and meaning to the analysis of language. Philosophy accompanies humanity in its attempt to understand the world and itself. Chapter 15. Contemporary Philosophy, Consciousness, Technology, and Ethics. Contemporary philosophy faces challenges that earlier epochs did not know in this form. While antiquity dealt with being, the Middle Ages with the relationship between faith and reason, and modern times with the conditions of knowledge, the 21st century is confronted with a world that is changing rapidly, technologically, politically, and ecologically. The questions have not become less fundamental, they have only taken on a new form. The focus is once again on people. But this human being is embedded in global networks, digital infrastructures, artificial intelligence, biotechnological interventions, and ecological crises. Philosophy must ask itself, what does consciousness mean in a world of intelligent machines? What does freedom mean when algorithms pre-structure decisions? What is the human being when his biological limits become technically expandable? One of the most pressing debates concerns consciousness. Neuroscience and cognitive research have made enormous progress. Brain processes can be measured more and more precisely. Mental states correlate with neuronal activities. But the classic question remains, how does subjective experience arise? The so-called hard problem of consciousness is to explain why and how physical processes are connected to inner experience. Even if we know all the neural processes, the question remains why it feels like something to have pain or to see a color. This is where materialistic, dualistic, and emergentist positions meet. Some claim that consciousness is completely reducible to physical processes. Others consider it to be an independent dimension of reality. Still others argue that it emerges from complex systems, i.e. arises at a higher level. With the development of artificial intelligence, this discussion is intensifying. If machines can solve complex tasks, understand language, and generate creative content, the question arises, can they also have consciousness? Or do they merely simulate behavior that we associate with consciousness? This question is not just theoretical. It has ethical consequences. If a machine were conscious, it would have moral status. But as long as consciousness cannot be clearly defined, its attribution remains uncertain. At the same time, the debate about transhumanism is growing. This current holds the view that humans can and should overcome their biological limitations with the help of technology. Artificial implants, genetic optimization, neural interfaces, all of these seem to open up the possibility of expanding humans. But what does it mean when aging, illness, or even death become technically modifiable? Does being human lose its previous meaning when it becomes modifiable? Or is it precisely in this that the human ability to shape oneself is fulfilled? Critics warn of alienation from one's own body, of social inequalities between optimized and non-optimized people, of an economization of life. Proponents see this as a continuation of human progress. Philosophical anthropology is facing a redefinition here. Are humans essentially biological, cultural, or technical? Is his identity tied to a certain form, or can it be transformed? In addition to these questions of consciousness and technology, ethics will take center stage. Digital technologies are fundamentally changing our living environment. Algorithms decide on creditworthiness, applications, access to information. Data is collected, evaluated, monetized. This raises the question of fairness and transparency. Who is responsible for algorithmic decisions? How can discrimination and manipulation be prevented? What rights do individuals have vis-a-vis digital platforms? Classical ethics is being expanded to include new dimensions. Autonomy no longer only means self-legislation in Kant's sense, but also control over one's own data and digital identity. Freedom is not only the absence of coercion, but also protection against invisible influence. Ecological issues are also becoming more urgent. Climate change, species extinction, and resource scarcity are not only political but moral challenges. What responsibility do present generations have towards future generations? Do non-human beings have moral status? Here, an environmental ethics develops that expands the anthropocentric view. Some take a position that recognizes nature as a value in its own right. Others plead for sustainable responsibility within the framework of human interests. At the same time, political philosophy is being rethought. Global migration, economic inequality, cultural diversity, and international institutions demand new concepts of justice. Classic models of the nation-state are reaching their limits. Cosmopolitan approaches argue for global responsibility. Human rights should apply universally, regardless of national borders. But how can global justice be implemented in practice? Who bears responsibility in a networked world? Questions of identity politics and recognition also shape contemporary philosophy. Individuals are increasingly defining themselves by cultural, gender, or ethnic affiliations. Philosophy reflects on these processes and asks how equality and difference can be brought into balance. Another field is bioethics. Advances in medicine and genetic engineering raise questions about the beginning and end of life. Prenatal diagnosis, euthanasia, artificial reproduction, all of this requires moral orientation. This once again shows the tension between individual freedom and social responsibility. Are we allowed to do everything that is technically possible? Or are there boundaries that we should not cross? Contemporary philosophy is pluralistic. There is no dominant school as in earlier eras. Analytical and continental traditions coexist. Interdisciplinary approaches combine philosophy with neuroscience, computer science, economics, or environmental science. What unites them is the insight that thinking cannot isolate itself from social developments. Philosophy is not just retrospective reflection, but active confrontation with current problems. The question of the human being remains central. Between biological nature and technical extension, between individual freedom and global responsibility, between subjective consciousness and algorithmic simulation, contemporary philosophy is looking for orientation. Perhaps it will return to its origins. Even in ancient times, it was about the good life. Today, this question arises under new conditions. How do we live well in a digitalized world? How do we preserve dignity in times of technical feasibility? How do we secure freedom when power becomes increasingly invisible? The answers are open. Contemporary philosophy does not provide definitive systems. It works in the mode of reflection, criticism, discussion. This is precisely where their strength lies. In a world that is changing faster than ever before, the ability to question oneself remains indispensable. This closes the circle of this journey through the history of philosophy. From myth to logos, from the search for primordial material to ethics, from metaphysics to language criticism, it was always about understanding the world and our place in it. Today we are faced with new questions. But the attitude remains the same: amazement, doubt, thinking. Philosophy does not end with a final chapter. It begins again and again, wherever people ask themselves what is true, what is good, and what it means to be human.